Tell me the name of this animal. Tiger is correct. What's 60 minus 7? 53. That's right. In what category would you put both a hammer and a screwdriver? Both tools. Yes. If you answered all three of those questions correctly and effortlessly, you're off to a great start in matching Donald Trump's intellect. You see, as part of a routine physical, Trump has just completed what he called a high-difficulty cognitive test. I scored a perfect 30 out of 30, considered extreme intelligence. Except that's extremely wrong. And we know this because we've spoken to the people who created the test.
The test was not designed to be an IQ test.
This test, called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, is not a test of intelligence. It's a screening tool for cognitive dysfunction. And I can show you why Trump was able to score so high now and in the past by showing you the test itself.
I aced it, right, Susie? I aced. I got every question right. And these are tough questions.
What's happening, friends? Welcome to Jack Mockler. Right now, Trump announced on Truth Social that he had aced his cognitive exam with a perfect 30 over 30 on the MoCA, backed by a White House physician's memo declaring him in excellent health. But the MoCA is a basic 10-minute screening test, not a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, and declaring victory on such a limited exam while framing it as exceptional has drawn widespread skepticism rather than putting questions about fitness to rest. Except, and you knew there was going to be an except, it is genuinely not that simple.
So this test, the starting point for figuring out what kinds of questions Trump had to answer is in this memo written by the official physician to the president, Captain Sean Barbabella. If we scroll down under Trump's neurological testing, cognitive function assessed with the Montreal Cognitive Assessment was within normal limits with a score of 30 out of 30. So I was curious, right? How impressive is a 30 out of 30? Well, I managed to track down this older version of the test. It is from several years ago, but it's a pretty standardized test with only very minor changes from year to year. There are also many versions of the various questions. So, as not to spoil the integrity of the test, we're only showing questions from one distinct version. Oh, and you see this name at the bottom? That's this guy who told us everything we know.
Some parts are meant to be more difficult than other parts, and some parts are actually meant to be easy. And because it was designed to be able to look at mild impairment and moderate impairment.
And the reason it is not that simple has nothing to do with whether Trump is actually cognitively healthy or not. It has to do with the nature of the test itself, the nature of the moment in which the test results were released, the nature of who is doing the evaluating, and the nature of why this report was released when it was released. All of those things are worth understanding before you take the perfect health declaration at face value, because there is a lot going on underneath this story that the Truth Social post simply does not capture.
So, in defense of Donald Trump, probably the hardest part about getting a perfect score comes about halfway through the test. And I'll administer it to you like it's for real, using the actual script that a test giver might use. This is a memory test. I'm going to read you a list of words that you will have to remember now and later on, so listen carefully. When I'm through, tell me as many words as you can remember. It doesn't matter in what order you say them. Leg, cotton, school, tomato, white. Say them back to me. Okay. And no matter how many you were able to actually recite back, I would read the list out to you one more time, and then you'd take another stab at saying them back to me in whatever order you want. Then, without me giving you any feedback about whether you're right or not, I would tell you to keep those words in mind, because I will ask you to recall those words again at the end of the test. Most of the test, most people would consider pretty basic stuff. For example, the actual first question in this particular test.
The health report was released against a backdrop of genuinely unusual public behavior from the president, including late-night social media outbursts, angry confrontations with reporters, and reports that aides were keeping him out of sensitive meetings because his presence was deemed unhelpful. Democratic lawmakers had been calling for a 25th Amendment review, and some Republicans had been asking questions quietly. The polling on public concern about the president's age and cognitive fitness had been running at elevated levels for months.
Is where the administrator would tell you to draw a line going from a number to a letter in ascending order, starting here with 1, then going to A, then to 2, and so on. And you have to finish here. Could you do it? Well, if you can, then that's 1 point out of 30 that you've just scored.
That's a task of executive function where you have to hold 2 sets of responses in memory. So what are the numbers in order and what are the letters in order? And you have to alternate between them.
And this is where the science of these tests actually gets pretty interesting. Because in this question, where you just have to draw a clock showing 5 past 10, it's not really about how good of an artist you are. It's about planning and sequencing. Like, yes, there are the mechanics of visualizing a clock face and drawing the circle, but to properly space out the numbers, you might start by writing the 12, the 3, the 6, then the 9, and then filling in the numbers in between. Then you're probably thinking, okay, how do I show 5 past 10, which is 10:05, meaning I need a shorthand pointing to the 10, and then a clearly longer line pointing at 5 minutes, which is the 1 on the clock face. It's actually pretty involved when you think about it. Not hard, mind you, for most people, but it certainly can be if you have some kind of impairment.
So the timing of a formal health report declaring perfect health and aced cognitive exams was not coincidental. It was a direct response to that pressure, a political communications move as much as a medical disclosure. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the test that Trump is so excited about having aced, is a legitimate clinical tool for detecting cognitive impairment. It is widely used by physicians and neurologists around the world. It was designed specifically to screen for early signs of conditions like Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, and it is a good test for what it was designed to do, which is to identify whether someone who is showing early warning signs of significant cognitive decline can still perform basic cognitive functions.
So you might see that the numbers are not spread out equally throughout the task, throughout the clock face. You're asked to place the hands at a certain time, and you might be very concrete in how you do it and set those hands at exactly the numbers 10 and 11, when in fact you were asked to place them at 10 after 11.
Anyway, point being, if you can draw a nice clock, that's 3 more points out of 30. Other ways to get points on the test? Tell me, what is this? That's right, that's a duck. That's 1 point. If you can identify what category of things both matches and a lamp belong to, they're both light sources, maybe, or 2 things that can get hot, then that's another point. Can you copy this 3-dimensional line drawing of a bed? That's worth a point. Do some basic math. 60 minus 7 a bunch of times. So 60, 53, 46, 39, 32, 25. You get at least 4 subtractions correct. You would get the maximum 3 points for that question. So that's already 10 points out of a possible 30 with just the questions I've gone through with you.
The test takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to administer and includes tasks like drawing a clock, identifying animals from pictures, recalling a list of words after a few minutes, naming as many words as possible that begin with a specific letter, and performing basic math and spatial reasoning exercises. A perfect score of 30 out of 30 does meaningfully indicate that someone does not have significant measurable cognitive impairment on those specific dimensions at the time of testing. That is real information. That is worth something. But here's the part that gets glossed over consistently in the political discussion around these results. The MoCA was not designed to comprehensively evaluate the full range of executive function, judgment, emotional regulation, decision-making under pressure, and complex cognitive capacity that running the presidency of the United States actually requires. Those things are genuinely different from what the MoCA measures, and a perfect score on the MoCA does not tell you how someone is going to perform during a 3 a.m. military crisis, or whether they are capable of processing the full complexity of a multi-front geopolitical situation without fixating on the wrong detail, or whether the emotional regulation needed to manage the most powerful office on earth is intact. The test does not measure those things, and the people claiming the test proves everything are claiming more than the test can actually deliver. The way Trump framed the result with the claim that no other president has taken this test is also worth scrutinizing. Trump has been taking the MoCA since at least 2018, and President Biden took it as well during his time in office. Some other presidents have had cognitive assessments as part of their annual physicals using various tools. The claim of no other president ever doing this is at minimum imprecise and arguably not accurate. But more importantly, it signals something about how the administration wants to frame the result as an unprecedented achievement, as proof of exceptional rather than merely adequate cognitive function. Scoring 30 out of 30 on the MoCA is not exceptionally difficult for someone without cognitive impairment. The test is not designed to differentiate between normal cognitive function and exceptional cognitive function. It is designed to detect impairment, and framing a passing result on an impairment screening tool as some kind of record-breaking achievement nobody has ever pulled off before is, well, it is a choice about framing that tells you more about what the administration is trying to accomplish politically than it does about the actual clinical significance of the score. Now let's talk about the independence question, because this is where the structural limitations of any presidential health report become important. White House physicians are military officers who serve at the pleasure of the commander-in-chief. They are appointed by and accountable to the administration they serve. Captain Shani Barbabella's career and professional standing are connected to his role in the Trump White House in ways that create at least the structural potential for incentives to exist around the framing of health reports. This is not an accusation that Barbabella lied or fabricated results. The MoCA score is what it is. The test is administered by a standardized protocol, and the score is the score. But the framing of a health report involves choices beyond just the test score. It involves decisions about what to include and exclude. It involves the language used to characterize the results. It involves what context is provided and what context is not. And those framing decisions are made by someone whose professional position is inextricably linked to the administration whose leader is being evaluated. That structural situation does not automatically mean the report is dishonest, but it does mean that independent external verification, the kind that would come from having Trump evaluated by physicians with no professional connection to the administration, would provide a meaningfully different level of reassurance than a White House physician's memo. The history of presidential health reports adds important context to understanding why this current report should be viewed with a degree of skepticism. This is not the first time Trump has aced the MoCA, and the administration has publicized the perfect score. In 2018, then White House physician Ronnie Jackson released a similarly glowing health assessment and similarly publicized the perfect cognitive screening score. At the time, the same debate played out, with critics questioning the independence of the evaluation and supporters pointing to the perfect score as definitive proof of fitness. Jackson himself made some claims about Trump's health that were notably more effusive than standard medical reporting, describing him as being in excellent health in ways that stretched the available clinical evidence. Jackson later became a congressman and became involved in his own controversies. The point is not to relitigate any of that. The point is that the pattern, a dramatic public health declaration, a perfect cognitive test result, the administration publicizing the score as proof against critics, is a recurring feature of how this administration has managed the fitness question. And the fact that it is a recurring pattern rather than a one-time event means we should be thinking about it as a communication strategy as much as a medical disclosure. The specific timing of this release tells you something about what is actually driving it. Trump's health report did not come out because the scheduled annual physical happened to fall on that date. It came out in the context of a sustained and intensifying public conversation about his behavior and fitness that had been building throughout the early months of the year. The 25th Amendment calls from Democratic lawmakers. The public reporting about aides keeping him out of situation room meetings because of concerns about his impatience. the late-night social media posts that generated global condemnation, the screaming behind closed doors during military escalations. All of those things created a political environment where the administration felt it needed to proactively push back on the fitness narrative. The health report, released when it was released, publicized as aggressively as it was publicized, with the all-caps Truth Social post accompanying it, was the pushback. It was a political communications move as much as a medical disclosure, and understanding it as both simultaneously is important for evaluating how much weight to give it. The critics who are demanding a full briefing and requesting independent evaluation have a legitimate point about process, even if some of their arguments about the substance are overstated. The question of whether the most powerful person in the world is cognitively and emotionally fit to discharge the duties of that office is a genuinely important public interest question that deserves more rigorous and more independent evaluation than a White House physician's memo and a Truth Social post can provide. That is true regardless of party. That is true regardless of whether you support or oppose the current administration's policies. And the polling that shows a significant percentage of the public expressing concerns about presidential age and fitness across multiple polling cycles reflects something real about what people are looking for from their institutions on this question. They want more than a memo saying perfect health. They want independent verification from sources with no professional stake in the answer. The 25th Amendment discussion that has been happening in response to concerns about Trump's behavior is also worth understanding precisely. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment provides a mechanism by which the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet can declare the President unable to discharge his duties without the President's agreement or consent and temporarily transfer executive power to the Vice President. It was designed specifically for situations where a president is incapacitated or otherwise unable to function but has not died or resigned. It has never been successfully invoked against a sitting president, and invoking it successfully requires the vice president and the cabinet, all of whom serve at the president's pleasure and were appointed by him, to take a step that would be politically and personally devastating for everyone involved. So when Democratic lawmakers call for a 25th Amendment review, they are not describing an imminent or likely event. They are making a political argument about the severity of their concerns and calling for a process that the Constitution makes available, but that the political realities make extraordinarily difficult to actually use. Understanding that distinction between the amendment as a constitutional mechanism that exists and the amendment as something that is realistically going to be invoked against this president is important for not either overstating or understating what the calls for a review actually mean. What the 25th Amendment discussions do accomplish, even without leading to actual invocation, is that they raise the public stakes of the fitness question in a formal way. They put it on the congressional record. They create a political obligation for members of both parties to respond to, either affirming they have concerns or affirming they do not. And they keep the question in front of the public in a way that the administration cannot simply wave away with a Truth Social post. Because once a formal mechanism of constitutional concern has been publicly invoked, even if it goes nowhere, it becomes part of the political landscape that the administration has to operate in. And operating in a landscape where the 25th Amendment is a live political topic, where members of Congress are publicly on the record raising fitness questions, is a layer of institutional pressure that affects how the administration is perceived and how it needs to manage its public communications about the president's health and behavior. Now let's be precise about what the MoCA actually tests and what it does not test. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment is a one-page clinical screening tool that takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to administer. It was developed in the 1990s specifically to help clinicians identify patients who might have mild cognitive impairment that could be a precursor to dementia. It tests short-term memory by having the subject remember a list of words and recall them a few minutes later. It tests visual spatial ability by having the subject copy a cube and draw a clock. It tests attention and working memory through number sequences and letter targeting tasks. It tests language through fluency exercises and naming objects. And it tests orientation through basic questions about date, place, and context. A perfect score of 30 out of 30 means someone performed all of those tasks correctly. And a perfect score genuinely does indicate the absence of the kind of basic cognitive impairment that the test was designed to detect. If you cannot draw a clock correctly, or recall 3 words, or identify a lion from a picture, that would be a meaningful clinical signal. Scoring 30 out of 30 means those basic functions are intact. That is real, and it matters clinically. But here is what the MoCA does not measure. It does not measure the quality of judgment under conditions of extreme complexity and pressure. It does not measure the ability to process contradictory or ambiguous information and arrive at sound decisions. It does not measure emotional regulation, the capacity to manage frustration, anger, anxiety, and fear in ways that produce rational behavior rather than reactive behavior under stress. It does not measure the capacity for strategic thinking across multiple concurrent high-stakes problems simultaneously. It does not measure the ability to accurately assess risk across long-time horizons. And it does not measure the executive function capacity that is specifically tested by the demands of managing the government of the most powerful country on earth during an active war, a domestic economic crisis, a congressional accountability push, and multiple simultaneous foreign policy challenges. These things are not captured on a 10-minute paper-based screening tool. They are exactly the things that people who have been watching the president's public behavior and asking questions about his fitness for the demands of this specific moment are actually concerned about. So the perfect MoCA score is real information about a real set of cognitive functions, but it does not answer the questions that the questions are actually asking. There is also something worth saying about the broader cultural and political context of presidential fitness debates in America right now, because the Trump Health Report is happening in an environment where the question of whether political leaders are cognitively and physically capable of discharging their duties has become significantly more salient than it was in previous decades. The Biden years produced a sustained and sometimes brutal public debate about age and cognitive fitness that was, whatever you think about how it was handled, a genuinely important conversation about a genuine question. And that debate raised the bar of public expectation around transparency and independent verification of presidential fitness in ways that are now going to apply going forward, regardless of which party holds the office. The public that watched that conversation, that saw how difficult it can be to get accurate and independent information about a sitting president's actual cognitive state, is now going to apply similar skepticism to health declarations from any administration. The White House physician memo and the all-caps Truth Social post are operating in that skeptical environment. They are going to be evaluated more carefully, questioned more vigorously, and believed less automatically than presidential health declarations were in previous eras. And that increased skepticism is actually healthy for democratic governance, even when it is inconvenient for any particular administration trying to use a health report as a political tool. The question of whether the person sitting in the Oval Office is truly capable of handling the demands of the presidency is not a partisan question. It is not a question that should be answered differently depending on whether you agree with the president's policies. It is a question that goes to the very heart of democratic governance, because if the person wielding the most consequential executive power in the world is not fully capable of discharging the duties of that office, the consequences for the country and the world can be catastrophic. And the current system for evaluating and disclosing presidential fitness, a White House physician's memo released at the administration's discretion, is not obviously adequate to the task. The presidency requires a range of cognitive and emotional capacities that are not systematically evaluated by any current public process, and the public's legitimate interest in knowing whether the person in charge is fully capable of doing the job is not being meaningfully served by the current combination of physician memos and social media posts. That is a structural gap worth identifying, even if you have no specific concerns about this particular president, because the gap would exist regardless of who holds the office. And filling that gap with more rigorous, more independent, and more publicly transparent evaluation processes is something that would serve the public interest across administrations and across parties. Now let's bring this all the way home and make sure we are being honest about what this story means and what it does not mean, and what the right takeaway actually is. The first thing to understand is that the MoCA score of 30 out of 30 is real, and it means something. It is not nothing. It is not fabricated. It is not meaningless. A perfect score on a clinically validated cognitive screening tool genuinely indicates the absence of the specific types of cognitive impairment that tool was designed to detect, and that is worth knowing. Anyone who dismisses the score entirely as meaningless or as proof of nothing is being intellectually dishonest. The test exists for a reason. A perfect score on it is a real result that carries real clinical meaning within its specific domain. And giving that result its appropriate weight, acknowledging it as meaningful within its limits, is part of being honest about this story. But the second thing to understand is that the limitations of the MoCA as a comprehensive evaluation of fitness for the presidency are real, and they are not trivial. The test was not designed to evaluate the specific cognitive and emotional demands of the most complex executive role in the world. It was designed to screen for early dementia. Those are not the same thing. And the gap between what the test measures and what the presidency requires in terms of judgment, emotional regulation, strategic thinking, pressure management, and complex decision-making is wide enough that a perfect score on the test does not actually resolve the questions that are driving the public concern. The questions driving the concern are about behavioral patterns, about decision-making quality under pressure, about emotional regulation in high-stakes situations, and those things are not assessed by drawing a clock or recalling 3 words. So the all-caps aced post is claiming more than the test result actually delivers. And recognizing that is also part of being honest about this story. The third thing to understand is what the timing and the framing of the health report reveal about the administration's communications priorities. This was not a routine disclosure. It was a strategic pushback to a specific and building political pressure. The perfect health declaration and the aced post arrived in a moment when the administration needed to change the subject and reframe the conversation around the president's fitness. And it worked for a news cycle. The coverage shifted from discussing the 25th Amendment calls and the Situation Room sidelining and the late-night social media posts to discussing the perfect cognitive test results. That is effective crisis communications. It does not mean the underlying concerns go away, but it changes what people are talking about for a few days. And understanding it as a communications move, rather than as purely a medical disclosure with no political dimension, is important for evaluating how much permanent weight to give it in the ongoing public conversation about presidential fitness. The history of how administrations have managed health disclosures is also worth considering. Presidents have been hiding or minimizing health problems for as long as there have been presidents. Woodrow Wilson's stroke was hidden from the public while his wife effectively ran the country. Franklin Roosevelt's declining health was concealed during his final campaign. John F. Kennedy's numerous medical conditions were kept secret. Ronald Reagan's early Alzheimer's symptoms were not disclosed during his presidency. The pattern is consistent. Administrations have powerful incentives to present their presidents as healthy and capable regardless of the reality. And that pattern of historical obfuscation is exactly why the public should be skeptical of any administration's health declarations and why independent verification matters so much. The public has been burned before, and the skepticism that results from that history is not irrational. It is the reasonable response of a citizenry that has learned that administrations cannot always be trusted to be fully transparent about the health of their leaders. So here is the bottom line. Trump aced the MoCA. The score is real. The test is real. The doctor's memo is what it says it is. And within the specific and limited domain that the MoCA was designed to evaluate, the result is meaningful. But the MoCA does not evaluate presidential fitness comprehensively. The physician issuing the report is not independent of the administration. The timing of the release is driven by political communications priorities as much as by medical disclosure requirements. And the questions that the 25th Amendment discussions and the Situation Room reporting and the public behavioral observations have been raising are not questions that a perfect MoCA score can fully answer. The president can draw a clock correctly and recall 3 words and still make decisions that concern the people around him enough to manage his access to Situation Room briefings during active war. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. And the public trying to evaluate what it actually knows about the fitness of the person running the country deserves more than a Truth Social post and a White House physician's memo to work from. The fitness question is not going away, and whether this health report puts it to rest, even temporarily, depends on whether the next news cycle produces more of the behavior that raised the concerns in the first place. Stay tuned because this story is far from over, and the conversation about presidential fitness is going to continue regardless of how many times the administration declares victory on social media.